Welcome all, and thank you for joining today's webinar on the economic benefits of 5G. My name is Caitlin Bruckner. I'm the spokesperson for the New Yorkers for 5G Coalition, and I'm also your moderator this morning. We have a great panel of experts joining us today to discuss what 5G is and how, once fully deployed, it will impact almost every aspect of modern life. But first, one quick housekeeping reminder. I encourage everyone watching to use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. I will then bring any and all relevant questions to our panel's attention, time permitting, of course. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our distinguished panelists. We have Anna Rua, Government Affairs Manager for New York City and State of Crown Castle, who's also today's webinar sponsor. We're also joined by Ted Rappaport, who's a professor at New York University and the founding director of NYU Wireless, which is the world's first academic research center to combine engineering, computer science, and medicine. And finally, we're also joined by Joe Carr, who's the Senior Vice President of Information Services at the Healthcare Association of New York State. Thank you all for being here today. So,
thanks for having us.
Of course. So, for everyone watching, I think it would be really helpful to start with the fundamentals of really why we're here today. So I guess to turn it over to you, Anna, first, can you just provide an overview of what 5G is and discuss the role that Crown Castle plays in making 5G a reality?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Caitlin. And I'd like to thank City and State, as well as really excited to be here with my co-panelists, Joe and Ted. So let's talk about 5G. What are the rudimentary elements of it? So 5G is the next generation wireless telecommunications infrastructure. And essentially, it is going to enable faster speeds and a tremendous amount of bandwidth and really low latency, meaning the time it takes for your device to connect to the network and back. And why that's important is because we're going to, in the next couple of years, have tens of billions of connected devices, everything from wearables to your car, to your home devices, and everything's going to be connected to the network. So we're really gonna need to enhance and create a robust rudimentary infrastructure. And so Crown Castle is the nation's largest shared wireless infrastructure provider. And what that means is that when you think about your mobile phone working, we provide that infrastructure. Cell phone towers, approximately 40,000 of those peppered throughout 48 states and in Puerto Rico. We have approximately 80,000 route miles of fiber optic, which, just to put it in perspective, is we can go around the circumference of the Earth twice over and then some a little bit more. And we have what are called small cells, which are carry-on size equipment boxes and equipment that goes on utility infrastructure. So either street lights or wooden poles that enhance, and like it all work in synchronicity to create a robust wireless network. And so small cells over the next couple of years, as we deploy 5G, the next generation of wireless technology, we will need to deploy many of those. And so that will really enhance the network, since it's closer to the person using it, to be able to enhance the network capacity and bandwidth.
Thank you, Anna. That's really useful information and helps set the stage for really why we're here today. So Joe, I know we're increasingly seeing the convergence of technology and healthcare, especially now during the pandemic. From your perspective, what do you see as the immediate benefits of improved connectivity in the healthcare industry?
That's a great question. And actually, healthcare has been, even before COVID, had been gone through quite a transformation. For the benefit of the audience, just to kind of tell you where people are coming from in healthcare and the leadership, they really are starting to really look outside the box, right? In terms of how to present and how to provide care to the community. And actually, if you talk to a CEO in a hospital or a health system, the first thing they'll tell you is that when they see a patient admitted, they see that as a failure, that they weren't able to reach out to that patient in their community to provide the care that they need to keep them out of a hospital. And most modern day hospitals, if you go into them after they've been redesigned and reconfigured, it's like walking into a mall, and it's really hard to tell that where do I admit if I'm a patient. Most of that is outpatient services and stores, a lot of healthcare information there. So if you think about technology and how it's really played a role during the pandemic, before the pandemic, there were a lot of investments in, putting in telemedicine and all the equipment associated with that. And in a lot of ways, sometimes not getting paid quite as well as they should for all that investment. And patients just weren't picking up on it, right? They weren't seeing, because they were used to, their patients are in the mindset of, okay, I want to go to my doctor, or I want to go to the hospital, or whatever, or I want to go to the ED. They just weren't thinking of healthcare in a telemedicine type of paradigm. So I think COVID changed a lot of that. A lot of our hospitals are telling us that they really, really saw a dramatic increase in the usage. And as you can imagine, the more you can do via telemedicine, via using a phone, or an iPhone, or any kind of mobile device, the more you can do, the better, right? In fact, some of these patients, you don't want them, especially during COVID, to come out of their house. So I suspect even after COVID is all behind us, hopefully soon, one of the benefits we'll have seen of patients seeing telemedicine as a new and easy paradigm, that they will start using it more. And now, of course, with 4G, there were limitations in terms of bandwidth, right? And a lot of areas, people were still LTE, right, in terms of their bandwidth. So I'm really, really hopeful that with 5G coming in right at the right time, we're going to see patients really start to leverage telemedicine more. I mean, it's really convenient whether you're elderly or whether you're, a young person who, doesn't really like to go to the doctors. Maybe you'll start to leverage that more. And as a result of that, have better health and stay out of the hospital, which is what we want to see.
And then I guess, Ted, over to you, similar kind of question. What do you see as the immediate benefits of 5G in improving education or even revolutionizing the experience for students?
Yeah, thanks, Caitlin and Anna and Joe. It's great to be with you. And thank you for City and State for having this informative gathering. As a wireless engineering professor who works with grad students and who's helped bring 5G to the world through our research at NYU Wireless, I kind of have a front row seat on the wireless telecom industry and have seen all 5 generations of cellular evolve. Just before I answer your question about 5G, what it will do, because it's very exciting what it will do, let me just help the audience understand the evolution of the cellular industry so that they know the G stands for generation, and we're in the 5th generation, and a generation happens about every decade, every 10 years. So you look at our cell phone from the 1980s where it was just analog FM and could be detected over any scanner and all we did was voice, to 2nd generation, which came out in the early 1990s when texting really was the first time ever we had done texting, imagine that. And internet really hadn't even come onto the scene yet. AOL hadn't even been public yet. And then 3rd generation came along right around the turn of the century. And that's when the web started to become useful, but very, very clunky. You had 3G phones. It was really the BlackBerry, and it was still primarily email and texting. But 4G LTE, which came out around 2010, is the first wireless standard in the history of the world where we could actually converge the internet and mobility. And so through the advantage of LTE, 4th generation, which is now about 10 or 11 years old, came new ideas, new companies that we never would have imagined. Google with YouTube, Netflix, over the top, the ability to use maps. How many of you use a paper map now? Well, we never even would have considered maps in our hand on a cell phone device until the iPhone came out in 2008. So to understand the generation of technology, often we build the technology to be faster, better, and cheaper for the value you get, and then the applications come later. To answer your question, Caitlin, what 5G is going to do is, as Anna said, it's going to provide this massive bandwidth that we've never had. For the first time ever, our cell phone will be able to carry fiber optic-like speeds to each consumer. And so what will fiber optic-like speeds do for each consumer? It'll provide the kind of healthcare and imaging and MRI images that could be shared between docs that Joe's talking about. It'll talk about, we'll be able to use the fiber optic backbone to bring that amount of capacity to the consumer. Students may not have to come to class very often because live lectures in 3D will possibly be delivered to them wherever they want to be, in their apartment, at home, on the bus. So this bandwidth, this capability of bandwidth is really going to revolutionize the next 10 years just the way 4G revolutionized the idea of watching videos, sharing information, maps, images, photos. You know, it's funny if you think about how many photos we take a day compared to before we had a smartphone, and how we transmit those photos to friends and neighbors and relatives and for work. It's unbelievable what 4G did from 3G. We're going to see that kind of leap again from 4G to 5G with this exponential order of magnitude bandwidth increase. And with it will come these amazing applications that will more and more make fiber optic speeds available to each of us. So we can get into on this panel what some of those applications will be, but we've written a number of papers on it, on what the future is, and we're even working on 6G. So the bottom line is this infrastructure, this densification of cell sites, bringing more and more lamppost towers, all at much, much lower power, closer to where people are, allows much, much more content to be delivered, so that we'll be watching television on our phones. We won't maybe even be using a fixed wire cable. We may be using wireless delivery to all of our set-top boxes and our televisions. So the future is very bright, and we can talk more about it. But that hopefully gives you an idea and sets a stage of how 5G is this transitional shift, which is normal in the evolution of the wireless industry. Just like in the computer industry, we've seen more and more power get into small and smaller devices, laptops, cell phones, when 50 years ago, that power was in a mainframe computer at some big base station somewhere in the mountains.
Thank you, Ted. This was incredibly helpful context. I think all of our viewers right now watching greatly appreciated that. And actually, I'd love to dive a little bit deeper. You've been talking about the innovations, and actually, let me turn it over to you, Joe, because we've actually already received a question from the audience on innovation in the healthcare space. So specifically on wearable technology, I know that that's becoming a trend as consumers and doctors really look to the future and recognize the power of sending and receiving data in real time. From your perspective, how can 5G improve this process? And are there any innovations coming down the pike that we should all be aware of?
Yeah, you know, it is just mind-boggling how this will really change everything, right? You know, as Ted talked about, you know, like there always this, when 5G first came in, there was always this ceiling you had. And so I remember when 5G was, I guess, around for the first year, and it was pretty widespread. I got the opportunity to see a concept of how we could start to apply various technologies, wearables, and other things in that space. And I saw this wonderful video this company had produced where it had EMTs out in the field, right? And they immediately got to the patient. They immediately connected a bunch of wearables to the patient. And then they had Google glasses and real motion video back to a physician at the ED. They were actually able to, emergency department, actually able to assist and see exactly what the EMT was seeing right when they got to the patient. So you can imagine that was just a phenomenal, mind-blowing innovation with both wearables on the EMTs as well as on the patient. And so I was like, wow, this is amazing. And seeing this video, and it was really well produced. And I started to talk to these folks who put this company together. And I said, so how does this work? I mean, are you able to get 5G? And do you have any kind of blips with that? Think about full motion video, a number of feeds, data feeds for the patients and all their vitals. And they said, yeah, you know, we haven't quite worked that out yet. We're still trying to work that out with. And I was thinking, boy, 5G can't get here fast enough, right?
And Joe, that's a really good point. There is still a build out to do, and Anna and her company and companies like Crown Castle are working feverishly to build out these smaller, more dense cell to get the coverage. That's a problem. But you know what you're saying about the healthcare, and to answer the question further, in 4G, devices have come for patients at home that never existed before. For example, you could have a heart problem, and the doctor will now give you a tape-on device that tapes onto your heart, and it connects by Wi-Fi or cell phone back to the hospital or to the doctor's office, or actually to a data monitoring center to monitor heart beats. So no longer do you have to have a device that you wear and take to the doctor a month later or a week later. There's real-time monitoring. And 5G is the first wireless standard by the cellular industry. And just to give you an idea, the cellular industry is a global consortium, the standard that makes every vendor's phone work with every other vendor's phone and every base station. The way cellular works is there's a global standard called 3GPP. It's an international standard body with 400 companies around the world. They all agree on the technical standards, so everything interoperates. And 5G is the first global wireless cell phone standard that will actually accommodate the Internet of Things. And IoT are very low power devices, almost like heartbeat devices, very low power drain. They can last for years or months with no battery change, that send back information. I think this is going to revolutionize healthcare. As Joe is talking about some of the imaging, it will also allow patients to monitor blood pressure, glucose levels, things that normally are not able to be done so easily remotely. It's going to enable in-home care better than we've ever seen before, because the standards are being built for those new applications of Internet of Things. That's why I've always taken the position that the cell phone technology is our friend, just like the computerization and the ability to work more efficiently is our friend. That bandwidth can really enable new things that help our quality of life. And healthcare, I think, is going to be a big beneficiary, as Joe said.
Yeah,
and
and
just
go
ahead,
ahead, Joe.
No, I insist. You, please.
Well, and to that end, Ted, I was going to say the dataization of our health from the moment that we're born is going to have significant implications towards the economic sustainability of healthcare in the long term and the growth of it. So they're going to be able to have massive amounts of data sets that will then help determine and create smart and innovative and in real time perfect treatments and care, and really reduce the overall cost of healthcare, which, as we know, is a significant burden to government. So this will have really positive implications for economic development and for governments and budgets writ large.
Yeah, I just want to say that 5G almost kind of gave us a glimpse into what the possibilities of the future are. And you're right, Ted, they've been in certain areas of the country that's been a little spotty. But just think about this. If we were able to get 5G everywhere you could possibly go in our country, right? I'll just give you one small little technology. It's not real complicated. Putting a little chip in slippers in elderly in their home, because as you know, when someone becomes old and they start to become ill and they take a fall, they break a hip, that was a whole series of problems happen after that, right? Wouldn't it be great if we can kind of see, wait a minute, this person, as Anna's talking about, the trend has been they're moving around their house at this pace, and suddenly they're not. That sets up a red flag to say, hey, we better get to that patient. We better figure what's going on there and maybe intercede before they have that fall, right? Before there's a problem. And again, if they get to the hospital with a broken hip, we failed them. So to me, I think the concept of the small cell concept really is appealing, because, if you think about, let me say this, 85% of the healthcare provided is for about 15% of our population, right? And who is that? Well, it's elderly or chronically ill folks, right? So the small cell concept to me really makes a lot of sense. If you've got a population in a community that is sedentary, can't get to the physician's office, and you can equip them with devices and put 5G in that community, boy, the opportunities are endless. Just a real quick story. I was in Vegas at a conference, and I was getting up every morning and doing a run. If you're a runner and you try to run in Vegas, you got to find some safe places because the traffic's a little bit of a nightmare. So I was kind of off the beaten trail, and I was coming across, unfortunately, a lot of homeless folks. And I noticed that they all had smartphones. And I remember asking somebody and say, oh yeah, in Nevada, the Medicaid department gives folks who are homeless a cell phone so they can kind of keep in touch. I thought that is brilliant, because right, this way you can kind of make sure, keep checking on them, making sure they're okay. If it's going to be really hot or really cold, you can get them to a shelter. I mean, it's just the idea is that's basically low tech. So again, 4G really was a glimpse in what 5G can deliver once we get it where it needs to go.
I'm seeing a lot of questions, Caitlin, come in about health effects of 5G. I get that question a lot. Maybe it's worth addressing, if that's all right, because we're talking about the benefits to healthcare and providing healthcare, but people seem to worry about the health effects of 5G. Should I address that, Caitlin?
Funny enough, it was going to be my next question, so please go ahead.
Okay, great. And I just sent out to everyone a title of a paper that I wrote. I'm also appointed in the School of Radiology at NYU Med School and work with my colleague, Chris Collins. We had a good PhD student. We actually looked at this issue very carefully before going broadly to the world on our 5G vision at NYU. Because as a responsible engineer and researcher, we were wondering what happens as you go higher in frequency. Let me first dispel a couple of myths that have been in the popular press, and I've given interviews to USA Today and CNN on this topic. Here's the bottom line. All 4 generations of cell phones before 5G operated in frequencies in the microwave band. The microwave band is 1 to 2 gigahertz, maybe 3 gigahertz in some countries. 1 to 3 gigahertz is the frequency of the radio wave. And giga means 10 to the 9. This is the frequency that your microwave oven works on. These are frequencies that have been used for police and fire and safety radio. These are frequencies that have been used for 40 or 50 years for two-way mobile communication. What 5G did for the first time in the cellular industry, it did a number of innovative things, but one of the big things in terms of frequency is it moved up an order of magnitude of frequency from around 2 and 3 gigahertz carrier frequency, where the radio waves are, and it moved up to 20 or 30 gigahertz of frequency, 28, 39, 24 gigahertz. These moved from the microwave frequency bands to the millimeter wave frequency bands. So that jump in frequency from 2 gigahertz to say 30 gigahertz is about an order of 10. Now, that's a big deal for the cellular industry, because to make electronics that fit in this phone that go higher in frequency, it takes a lot of R&D to make power efficient devices, to learn how to do the circuits. It's a big leap forward when you've been doing cellular engineering for 40 years and then move to another higher frequency. It's kind of like the transmissions in cars. You know, I used to be able to work on my car when I was in high school, but somewhere along the line, cars got so complicated that I can't get even in there to change the alternator. Same thing has happened to 5G in the cell phone industry. But you must understand this. Going from microwave to millimeter wave frequencies is still so far lower in frequency than the frequencies that we know can cause health problems, can cause mutations to cells, can lead to cancer. Those kinds of frequencies are up above visible light. And Caitlin, I could share my screen if you want a little later in the presentation to make this graphic clear. I've published it in papers. But you have to understand, millimeter wave is still 4 orders of magnitude, 10,000 times lower in frequency than the frequencies that we know can lead to problems that could damage cells. Visible light, the light we see, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet, the visible light spectrum is 430 terahertz to 790 terahertz. Terahertz is not terahertz is 1,000 times more than gigahertz. So optical light is 430 to 790 terahertz. It's frequencies above light, ultraviolet, X-ray, gamma ray. These are the frequencies that are known by the experts in radiology that with significant deep doses can cause cancer. In fact, if you look at NASA's biggest concerns of sending astronauts to Mars, one of the top 5 concerns are radiation, because once we go above the troposphere and get out into above about 6 miles above Earth, we're bombarded by galactic radiation, by the sun and the stars, sending ultraviolet, X-ray, ionizing radiation. And so they're worried once you get above that troposphere, which gives Earth a natural protection, that we'll be bombarded by astronauts will be. That's my biggest concern for space travel, other than the rocket going off the direction. But so ionizing radiation is what we know is harmful. And all the research we did at these frequencies, 10,000 times lower, which means 10,000 weaker energy, is the only thing we could ever find in that paper that we wrote in 2015 called Safe for Generations to Come. I put it on the chat. The only possible thing we could see that would be a concern is heating. When you have RF energy that heats the cells up to a high degree to where you get an RF burn, a radio frequency burn, or you elevate the heat, It's heat that can cause damage to cells and cause mutations. So the key thing in all the studies, in all the wireless work and all the government regulations, they're based on how much radio energy from a cell phone will heat your body, will heat your skin, will cause a rise in temperature. Well, the power levels used by cell phones, and when base stations are, a few feet away from you, the radiation weakens so much through air, it's called free space equation, that by the time the energy reaches you, it's so weak that it does not cause a rise in temperature. So I encourage people to really understand the facts. There's a lot of hype on this about the safety concerns and health effects, but everything I know that I've studied and everything that the industry knows based on repeatable evidence, that is repeatable evidence, is that there's not sufficient heating that can elevate to cause any observable effect, and there haven't been repeatable observed effects over years and years of study.
Thank you.
And I guess the takeaway is 5G is increasing the bandwidth, the amount of information you get through, by riding it on a higher carrier frequency. But that higher carrier frequency is still 10,000 times weaker, lower in energy and lower in frequency than frequencies known to be ionizing, that cause ions to move out of the electron and destabilize, namely ultraviolet, X-ray, and gamma ray. And to put a fine point on it, I've told USA Today, citizens need to be more worried about putting on sunscreen to protect from UVA and UVB rays, and need to be more worried about how many flights they're taking above 10,000 feet internationally. Of course, no one's flying with COVID. And they need to worry about how many unnecessary X-rays they're getting before they worry about their 5G phone.
So 5G is safe and secure.
Safe, everything I know to believe, 5G is safe. Secure is a very good question. Security and cybersecurity is continually an issue for all telecommunications, and 5G is going to be as safe as they can make it. But you heard the previous administration express concerns about security and international eavesdropping on networks. I think that those concerns were not totally unfounded. Whenever you have telecommunications, cybersecurity is an issue. So the industry is always trying to make it perfect, but just like any wireless technology, if it radiates, it can be intercepted. And if it can be intercepted, there's no guarantee 100.000% that it's secure. Just like anything we do is never perfectly secure, but they're making it as sure as they can of all generations of cellular.
Thank you. And excuse me, I'd actually like to switch gears a little bit. We've seen some questions come in around equity and the digital divide. I know that as a result of the pandemic, there's now widespread acceptance that online access, it's not a privilege, it's a necessity, it's a right. But it's really out of reach for millions of Americans, including many here in New York. So Anna, I'd love to hear from you. How can 5G help close the digital divide?
Absolutely, Caitlin. I'll speak about New York City in particular. The way we built our networks through our agreements with the city of New York actually requires that we build them out in the outer boroughs overwhelmingly by 70%. When we build 5G, we obviously build with density in mind, because we build it based on demand, right? So people go to work, they leave the outer boroughs and go to the city center to work and then come back. And then we have to manage that flow, and the networks have to mirror and support the use, right? But I can say resoundingly, as we build the networks in New York City and in the surrounding regions in Long Island and Westchester, we are building these networks equitably throughout the 5 boroughs, throughout the densified regions. Now, I'd seen some questions coming up about the digital divide, the urban and rural divide. And so I'd like to make sure that I address that as well. As part of the T-Mobile merger, and many of the other cable wireless carriers are also doing this, AT&T and Verizon, and hopefully Dish will come online soon. Part of their strategy is to absolutely deploy in rural regions with a variety of spectrum, right? And so specifically in the T-Mobile merger, they are compelled through the merger negotiations to deploy 5G to 96% of the geographic region of the United States. So that in and of itself should give people kind of an understanding that there is a baseline to build these networks equitably throughout urban and rural, and to bridge urban digital divides. So I believe it will close the digital divide as opposed to expand it. The key to ensuring that we do this, though, is to maintain the cost of building these networks down. And so municipalities and governments can help us do that by really being a terrific partner in terms of the permitting timeframes. I was just telling Ted and Joe earlier, on average, to build these networks, it takes 24 to 36 months. And 90% of that delay is because when companies like Crown Castle submit for a permit, there is an expanded time frame for review. And that really adds cost to our ability to deploy. And municipalities sometimes believe that they're entitled to charge more for access to the utility structures that we deploy on. One of the things that we like to think, and we like to respond with, is that we're building these networks for the United States of America. And so, it's 50 states. And so the money is limited. So to the extent that governments and local municipalities can help us really and partner with us on the timeframes and the negotiation of the agreements on what the access to those poles look like financially, monetarily, that's really going to help us spread out the money so that we can deploy these networks even more equitably than we would and are doing.
If I could just add to that, if you think about the paradigm of cable, or or if you have fiber coming to your home, think about that. The company's got to invest in building that framework. They've got to dig into the ground. If you've ever had fiber in your house, they tear up your lawn, right? You've got to get all the equipment. And I think if COVID taught us anything, that there is a technical divide, because children in homes that were underserved, that didn't necessarily have all that technology, who then had to go and take mobile classes they didn't have a laptop, or they didn't have enough Wi-Fi bandwidth. It was a myriad of problems, and it really is breaks my heart to see that happened. But if you think about the paradigm with mobile, you're not talking about all that. You're not talking about where you got to invest not only, and you got to install it and people got to buy it. All you got to do is buy the device, right? And if we can somehow fund the towers and the device, that's a heck of a lot less complicated, and certainly a lot to do that faster than if you've got to go, tear up earth and put in lots of lines. So I just think that there is a promise here, perhaps, if we get the funding to really bridge this divide with 5G.
And 5G is the first cellular standard globally adopted that has sufficiently wide bandwidth channels that can now be viewed as a backhaul fiber replacement. I mean, it's the first time you can think of that old buried copper that's in a lot of the rural markets, this old DSL, which isn't being kept up or invested by the wireline carrier maybe. You could actually drop in every couple of kilometers telephone poles or small towers and daisy chain, kind of linked together 5G radios that are just pointing from tower to tower over a couple of miles and carry enough traffic that you could provide very high quality internet in rural areas without having to dig up the ground, without having to bury the cable or bury the fiber. You could actually, for the first time with 5G, do rural broadband deployment for backhaul, going back from the big servers to bring the content out to homes, and then distribute the homes with 5G wireless. So that's a very exciting vision that NYU, we've been promoting for many, many years. We did the first research in the world on how 5G could work in rural areas. I have a home in rural Virginia with terribly poor DSL service, less than 2 megabits per second if it's working. Very frustrating. So I personally have been very passionate about seeing 5G solve the digital divide, and it really can. The cost points are coming down as these deployments happen. So the densification of these lower cost, lower power units will drive the cost down where it could actually be used in rural markets as well.
And we talk about, just to add to that, we talk about telemedicine, right, in rural areas where, as Ted just mentioned, where we don't have the bandwidth to support that. That's even more difficult because those folks have to get in a car and drive several hours just to get an appointment, right, to see their doctor for a regular schedule. Just think if they're sick, right? It's just a myriad of problems. So to me, telemedicine has really worked in densely populated parts of the country, but have just not really gotten the job done. You have to go to a local Kinko's and maybe even drive 2 hours to get to that if you're in rural America. And as you know, New York State, we've got a lot of rural areas. So yeah, I agree with Anna. I think, that's really, we've got to focus on both the inner cities. We also have to look at the rural communities as well.
Thank you. And I'd actually love to take a step back for a moment and address the title of today's webinar, which is really around the economic benefits of 5G. I know that there are several reports on the importance of 5G and its ability to strengthen New York's economy. I'd love to open this up to the group. Do you mind addressing how the broad implementation of 5G can aid in the state's economic recovery efforts, especially against the backdrop of COVID?
Yeah, I'll take a first stab and then I'm going to punt it over to Ted. So the investment in 5G and the jobs associated that are going to come out of 5G, according to a report by CTIA, which is our association and the Wireless Association, is approximately $32 billion and 193,000 jobs. That is in direct investment if we realize this network. So it's really extraordinary, and it's going to have folks often think of telecommunications as altering, sure, healthcare, education, but 5G is really going to alter every single part of our society, of the way we work, of the way we function, our car drives through our GPS. It's going to touch everything from manufacturing, going to go in aerospace, unmanned aerial systems and drones. Innovation will be bred out of this that we can't even begin to imagine. And so I will say, Caitlin, without a shadow of a doubt, we are so excited about the economic contribution that 5G will make to reinvigorate New York in this most critical time in our history, right? And not only New York City, but New York State and the country as a whole. Ted, I don't know if you want to add more there.
Well, I think the amazing value of telecom in general has been proven through this COVID pandemic. Think about our society and how we just totally changed our entire lives over the last 14 months. I mean, the last year, humankind has completely adopted an entirely new way of life. And if it weren't for the telecommunications grid and the existing plant, the cable plant, the cellular plant, what would our society have been like? The fact that we've actually been able to cobble and hobble together and keep in contact and do the best we can, although it's been very hard, and certainly probably the divisions have appeared even greater now in COVID, which I hope would gain attention. But the fact that we've actually been able to continue as a society with some degree of reliable communication, I think that alone speaks volumes of the necessity for the US to continue to invest, to continue to build the plant and the infrastructure, to continue to make sure that no matter what will happen, we can stay connected. So from an economic benefit, I guess the question would be a functioning network versus a not functioning network in terms of productivity and even mental health. Just being able to stay in touch is a real critical component. I don't know how to value that. Smarter people than me can figure that out. But I think that alone speaks volumes of the need for the US to continue and for New York to personally take a lead in making sure we continue to expand and build connectivity in all forms. And then I think the second big economic dividend should come to rural America and rural New York. I really see 5G and the bandwidth it provides to really, for the first time, offer telecom carriers a low-cost alternative to finally upgrading the degraded plant that serves so many homes in rural America. I think 5G is the first time that you can buy off-the-shelf, globally standardized equipment that works with every cell phone, and for the first time deploy infrastructure into rural America, not just from a base station to cars, but base station to hop that data through to get these huge bandwidths to serve lots and lots of homes. And, so I think that's a huge benefit. But Joe probably has more ideas about how in healthcare and telemedicine, how there could be real benefits.
Well, I mean, just to add to what you and Anna already said, I mean, and you kind of hit on this earlier, Ted, when you talked about the Internet of Things, right? I mean, could you imagine 10 years ago if somebody said to you, yeah, your doorbell is going to have kind of a smart aspect to it, where it's going to be able to record and become security as well for your home and interact with the internet, and you can be in North Carolina and see that somebody's ringing your doorbell in New Jersey. I mean, think about that for a second. So I say that the biggest holdup with Internet of Things to this point has been, are you in a community where you've got bandwidth, right? Or not? If you have 4G in your community, great. If you don't, then oh well. And so I think there's going to be a huge economic boom, because there's a lot of companies like the one I talked about earlier, right? About that mobile EMS unit that couldn't work because as soon as they start rolling, they might lose connectivity, right? So these are all things I think are going to really drive economic ability here in terms of ways we can't imagine. I also, in terms of healthcare, just want to point out to a lot of the audience that you think about some of the hospitals, especially in the urban areas where these hospitals have been around for a long time, these buildings are really old, just pulling cable in those buildings is sometimes impossible, right? And so they went to Wi-Fi, and even that has its limitations, in terms of various things. But I know that there's been a lot of success stories out throughout the country where people have put, the 5G small cells in certain areas for certain purposes, and it's really solved a lot of problems. It's just that, once you get outside of that zone, it's where it kind of like starts to diminish in terms of your effectiveness. But the thought in my head is, okay, if we get this everywhere it needs to be, then hopefully, we're going to see a lot of boom. We're going to see communities that suddenly are going to have a lot more people living there because they simply can and don't necessarily want to live in an urban area. So I think there's a lot of boom that happened here. Sorry about that.
So it sounds like the economic benefits are widespread, to say the least. But I guess when looking to the future now, what policy changes need to be made to actually get us there at both the state and local levels to encourage and speed the necessary investment to make 5G a reality, not just a reality, but in all corners of the state, to kind of go back to the digital divide question? What needs to happen next?
Yeah, so we need to be able to build these networks again, Caitlin, within prescribed timeframes, and to be able to, keep the cost reasonable so that we can deploy these networks. So the federal government, the FCC, under the last Chairman Pai, had issued what is called a small cell order, which essentially was prescriptive of those two things: what municipalities could charge, and when a company submitted a permit, basically was prescriptive of the timeframes to respond to that. 32 states have codified it. The small cell order was challenged in federal court, but the federal court vindicated that it was indeed in our national interest to ensure a safe and speedy deployment of 5G. So, in New York right now, since we're here, New York could take the next step and codify the small cell order from the federal government, as 31 other states have done at this moment. So really, it saddens me, because I'm such a tried and true New Yorker, that we're really falling in the middle of the pack and really starting to fall behind in not doing and not passing that small cell order, especially when our neighbors, New Jersey and Pennsylvania, look to be passing it probably sometime this year. They're leading us on recreational marijuana, and they're going to be way ahead of us in the 5G space and passing and codifying this order. So municipalities really and states really need to take a hard look at holistic policies that create a better environment for us to deploy these networks. Particularly in New York City, I saw a question from Al Jenkins, who was formerly at the Department of Information Technology, about, the ubiquity of 5G is absolutely going to require that we go beyond utility poles and streetlights. There is, just simply put, not enough structures. So we're going to really have to work with innovative design, and the entire industry. I know in New York is committed to working together. It really is a fantastic collaborative environment of all of the carriers and all of the infrastructure companies. We all work collaboratively together to put forth thoughtful designs that will think of the next step and of that next infrastructure that will help support 5G. Because one thing folks forget about 5G is that it's going to take a lot of different technologies, right? So the towers create the coverage. You have the rooftops that are going to be supporting it as well with a variety of spectrums. Then you're going to have small cells in the millimeter wave. And we're going to need to densify the entirety of all of this with robust fiber optic, which gives it essentially the arteries and the bloodstream to be able to function nearly at the speed of light. The only thing that stops fiber optic from transmitting the speed of light is the hardware at the end that cannot compute it. So it's really exciting. And so municipalities, governments, leaders, mayoral candidates, we're very eager to engage as an industry with all of them to talk about, how we can do this together.
And let me add to what Anna said, because I spoke to the FCC on that. I was on their technical advisory committee, and I told the FCC commissioners of both parties. And I want to be clear, the US got the lead in 5G because of Tom Wheeler, who is President Obama's appointment, and Chairman Pai, who is Donald Trump's appointment. So it's not a political thing. The US took the lead in 5G because of Chairman Wheeler and Chairman Pai of both sides of the aisles. Great FCC chairman that realized, and this goes back to your last question, Caitlin, about economic competitiveness and value. We are in a global competitive race for the future of our economies. We're competing with Europe, with China, with Japan, with Korea. If you look at the investments in Africa, China leads the world in investments in Africa. We're going to Mars and the moon. China's looking at Africa for the next places to invest and grow. If you look at their telecom network, it's all Chinese, pretty much. Why I say that is the importance for America to keep pushing and expanding the telecom infrastructure is our citizens, our kids, our aunts, our uncles, our parents, who are getting information either from school or from work or from the news or whatever, from the doctors, from the healthcare industry. We have to have the most competitive telecom infrastructure for our citizens to be internationally competitive in the future. So that, it's hard to put a number on it, but I would like to see the US have the next Google or the next Uber be invented on US soil and create American jobs rather than it be invented on another country's soil. And the only way that Uber and Netflix and YouTube happened was because of the amazing wireless infrastructure, the cellular telephone infrastructure, and the commitment. So when the FCC created the Small Cell Act, which had complete support, bipartisan support, it basically was acknowledging a fundamental fact that lawmakers have to realize. And I've seen this over my entire career in wireless. And that fact is this: a lot of municipalities have seen the big bucks that they can make by leasing and renting out spots on water towers or public parts of the publicly owned property to cell phone carriers to extract a monthly rent. And cell phone carriers, from my experience, are happy to pay reasonable charges. But what sometimes happens is there's an inordinate delay, actually a built-in delay, which is kind of a hidden tax on the cell phone industry to build out the infrastructure needed to bring the technologies and bandwidth to every one of those citizens in that community. So the citizens basically are being thwarted from getting the latest and greatest bandwidth and capabilities, applications to the latest release of YouTube or Uber or Lyft or whatever those applications are, because the city sometimes has this delay effect to try to either extract revenue or to create so many delays, which causes litigation, where a number of cities and states, as Anna said, have kind of embraced the fact that the citizens win if it could be done in a responsible, fair, measured way. And I gave a talk to the FCC, you could find it publicly, where I actually went through and looked at a bunch of cities around the country to see what their zoning ordinances were. And it was remarkable. Some cities really were aggressively trying to enable the build out. They had rules, you know, don't make it ugly, keep it within a certain square meter, certain volume, very sensible rules. And my experience is the industry would love to have that clarity so they can build out and tell the vendors to make the equipment small, make the antennas small, make it unobtrusive. That all can be done. But I think local governments actually hamper their citizens by not realizing that it's basically a tax on the whole citizens they're representing, by not trying to codify rules in places to allow a more frictionless deployment. I mean, think about it. You get power to your home. We're all communicating because we have electric power coming to every one of our house. You know, the wireless industry is kind of like the electric utility industry 80 years ago, the 30s and 40s. They were building out telephone poles. Maybe you have power that's underground. Maybe you have telephone poles, but there's telephone poles like outside my front door. I see telephone poles every 60 feet. I thank those telephone poles because they give me the power and keep me warm when it gets cold. We need to view wireless the same way. And those right-of-ways where the telephone poles work and where the gas lines work, those right-of-ways should also be made available to cellular carriers so they could put in their fiber optic cable or put in unobtrusive lawn furniture. I think the wireless industry calls it furniture or cellular furniture. I forget, you know, these
Street
little boxes.
furniture.
What?
Street furniture.
Street furniture, that's it, street furniture. So anyway, I'm an engineer, you know, I'm an academic, I'm not a, you know, I'm not in the carrier business, but
I am not an engineer.
So what I've seen, the point is that, you know, if I did not know that New York State had not codified the small cell initially, I did not know that till this phone call, so I learned something very useful. I think we should get behind it. It's to everyone's advantage to allow the telecom infrastructure to grow, just like we allow gas lines and power lines to be deployed in a new neighborhood.
So I actually want to address one of the more recent questions that came in. It's switching gears a little bit, but it's on the topic of smart city initiatives. I think, Anna, this question should be for you. How will the broad implementation of 5G help facilitate the creation of smart city initiatives in New York? And can you also just provide a little bit of information for those that are not aware? What are smart city initiatives?
Great question. Thanks so much, Caitlin. So I want people to think about smart cities and equate it with what I think is efficiencies. And so it is essentially going to be sensors and the dataization of human movement and behavior to make cities more efficient. That is going to help budgets writ large. So what does that mean? It means light sensors that can turn on and off on their own, you know, creating an efficiency in our energy grid system. It means, you know, when the trash needs to be picked up and creating better route systems with that data so that we can have efficient cleanup of our cities. It means street cleaning will be easier. That our water systems will be also have sensors and be able to be kept clean throughout its entirety. I mean, the possibilities are endless. In terms of administrative function and the day-to-day, we're going to be able to have consultants be monitored so that there is efficiency in our procurement system. You know, the possibilities are just endless. So when we think of smart cities, it's not like this dystopian kind of thing. It is about making government work better for its citizens. That is what a smart city is. That's going to be done through sensors and lighting, going to monitor air quality. There's actually a really cool partnership that we have going on in the city of Philadelphia. 1 in 4 kids in the Philadelphia school district are asthmatic. So this goes back to the healthcare piece of this, Joe. And the city and the officials are really trying to understand why. There are similar and comparable figures with our kids in the New York City school system, especially in the Bronx. 1 in 4 asthmatic. And they're really trying to understand why. So they're running a sensor program where they're providing sensors in the home of the kid, as well as in the schools, to try and monitor the air quality and understand the air particles and capture all of that so that they can understand the source and the sources of what is causing this asthma in the kids. That is going to have significant long-term, once we quantify and are able to understand all of that data in the long term, that is going to have significant positive effects to the healthcare institution of Philadelphia, but it's going to obviously reverberate throughout the entirety of education systems throughout America. So that is what a smart, efficient city is. It is about being able to deliver faster, more innovative, more efficient services to our kids, to our citizens, and it's just very exciting.
Thank you, Anna. And I recognize that we are coming up on time, so I actually just have one final question to ask all of you, and I'd love to start with you, Joe. If you had one parting thought just for today's audience, what would that be? What would that kind of key takeaway be?
You know, it's interesting. We look through a history of our time, and Ted kind of talked about this. Every new innovation, there was always that whoa, wait a minute, you know, this could be unsafe, or this could be, you know, even heart surgery for a while was like looked down on because people were really worried about it. So I think if one thing proves itself is that the more technology and the more ability we have from our technologies in terms of bandwidth and information ability within computers and the speed at which they can do that, it's really dramatically helped our society. It's dramatically helped what we can do. Now, of course, we've got some things we've got to deal with, like cybersecurity and all those things. But I said the minute we stop progressing, then we're going to go the other direction. And as Ted pointed out as well, other countries are going to go right past us. So I think it's really, really up to all of us to make sure we continue to push forward and to continue to innovate and come up with new and more wonderful ways of doing things. And I think this technology really is going to be a major breakthrough to help us get there.
Second, over to you, Ted.
I would just say, you know, having worked in the engineering profession and watching the evolution of the internet and the cell phone industry, I think the key is to get those resources to the people that aren't in the major population centers. So I think New York would do really well to encourage 5G build outs in rural areas, to encourage the access as quickly as possible and as realistically as possible to try to bridge the digital divide. I mean, you see it in school systems, not just cell phone care coverage, but just how school systems are funded in big affluent cities versus cities that are maybe more rural and less affluent. And I think wireless is that one commodity that really could, with 5G, become equalized to give everyone access to information and to the web.
And I would say, you know, we as an industry stand at the ready to build these networks to drive this future innovation. And so we really, I would say, it's a call to action. You heard it here. You heard from the experts, from the healthcare industry, from NYU Wireless. We as an industry are driving the investment to build these networks. Help us do this in a speedy manner. Our economic development is reliant on it. Our success and our rebirth in New York City and in New York State is reliant on it. So we could use all of your voices to support us as we deploy these networks for the United States of America.
Great. And with that, I just want to take a moment to thank all of our panelists as well as City and State for today's really thoughtful and incredibly timely conversation. It is very clear that 5G will deliver the high-speed connectivity needed to not only strengthen New York's economy, keep the US competitive, but also just create brighter futures for millions of families, communities, and businesses across the state. If anybody watching wants to learn more, I encourage you to visit NewYorkersFor5G.com. So with that, thank you all again for your participation, and thank you for those who tuned in.